Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer. I'm the host, Neil Trotter. And today, we're going to be talking about metaphysics, epistemology, and we're going to do that with a close examination of this philosophical text by the great continental philosopher, Immanuel Kant, and we're going to be talking about his work. I'll show you right here. The Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. And the version I got here, the edition is the Library of Liberal Arts edition. So, what is the Prolegomena? I'm gonna be like struggling to say that from time to time. The Prolegomena is a shorter work of Kant's. It's nowhere near as big as that big ass work that he created called the Critique of Pure Reason. And I would say that it's a great, maybe you've read the Critique of Pure Reason and you're like, okay, this is just too much. this is a doozy. I would say try Prolegomena, right? Try that, because that's a great introduction, this work right here. I think it's a great primer, because he's kind of going over what he's going to be talking about more in depth in the Critique of Pure Reason. Even though he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason before this work, I think it's actually pretty solid introductory to the Critique of Pure Reason, if that's what you're interested in. And I think he even, like Kant talks about this in the preface of this work, that he was criticized. He's kind of responding to the critique of people critiquing his Critique of Pure Reason as it's too convoluted, it's too much words, and it's hard to read. So he's like, okay, let me come out with this work to help people, kind of ease them into my big ass Critique of Pure Reason work. He talks about that in the preface of this work. But I think the Prolegomena stands on its own, and it has some great insight in its own accord, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to tackle the concept of objective knowledge versus subjective knowledge, right? two different kinds of knowledge, and there are many different names Kant and other philosophers use to describe this kind of knowledge. One is like a priori. That's what a term philosophers use a lot. That is knowledge, like knowledge without experience. Yeah, pure knowledge. That's another word that's used often to describe this pure knowledge. This is like, abstract concepts, like mathematical concepts. For instance, like circles or squares or lines, or geometric spatial objects, space itself, certain kinds of logic, certain kinds of mathematics, numbers, for instance, So you have that knowledge as opposed to experiential knowledge, which is, the term is thrown out as a posteriori. That knowledge, I'm not going to try and use those words that often. Practical. Kant wrote another book called The Critique of Practical Reason, which I covered in a video where he talks about more experiential knowledge that's gained through experience, emotions, relationships, stuff from the five senses, touch, taste, smell. Oh, this food tastes good. How that's experiential knowledge. That's practical knowledge, right? Things like that. Subjective. We threw that term versus objective. Universal versus like individual. Individual for more practical knowledge, and universal for the pure, the abstract, the a priori knowledge, right? So there's these two kinds of knowledge which Kant really focused on, and many other philosophers talked about as well. And he's trying to give, his analysis of like, okay, what is this thing? Like, what is practical knowledge? What is pure knowledge? And can we really get at the heart of it? Do we really understand what these two kinds of knowledge are? So the questions being asked here in this book is like, it talks about like subjective objectivity. We're going to go into that. concept. Like, is there such thing as objectivity? Like, can something really be objective? And we talked about this in my other videos, like the critique of pure reason. And I did a video about the critique of practical reason, where, you know, you have an object, right? Like this book, and the experiential knowledge is, oh, it's a bunch of pages, text in the book. You know, it's even made by trees, paper, but, you know, there's a deeper reality that this book is, which is like, oh, it's a collection of atoms, but then those atoms are actually built of all these subatomic particles, and who knows, maybe there's more fundamental particles that we're not aware of. And then, you know, the question then becomes, well, can we ever become aware of the true nature of this book? Or are we just limited to the experiential understanding of what this thing is, right? The pages, or can we truly know like the actual objective reality of that thing, like the subatomic particles and how they interrelate to everything else, and you know, that kind of thing. We're going into that kind of thing, and you might be hearing me saying this, and you might be like, oh, here we go. This is why I don't like philosophy, because it gets all into this mumbo jumbo and into the weeds, and like, what does it matter? What only matters is like you know, what we experience. You know, the text in the pages and the knowledge we get from the text, like all that other stuff, the objectivity, like, it's irrelevant. And you know, and that type of mindset, that type of idea, Kant wants to push back against. Kant's saying like, well, no, actually the objective reality is important. It's very important, but we gotta understand the limit of it. And he pushes back against philosophers who might have promoted or through their ideas, like David Hume, which we're going to discuss. This is also a work where he's critiquing Hume's philosophy, in that like, oh, all experience, we can only know experiential knowledge. There's no way of us understanding objective knowledge. And Kant's in this book is saying like, well, yes and no. You know, there is a way that we can access objective a priori knowledge in a very limited way through our experience, right? And that's very important to understand. Like, to just say like, oh, we can never access that knowledge and it's no use to us, that would be wrong, foolhardy, and actually detrimental. So there's a higher meaning to this, and there's an importance to this that I appreciate and I want to highlight in this video. So here in the Black Ponderer, what we do is we read quotes from the text. That's what we do. We actually read the book, and then I just provide supplementary commentary in the video, and then you can add your 2 cents in the comments section down below, or not, you know, it's up to you. But that's how we roll here in the Black Ponderer. So I will begin. Again, this is the Library of Liberal Arts edition. Do you have that version? I don't know. But in case you want to follow along, because people do ask for page numbers, here you go. This is page 15. This is the last paragraph. First of all, we must observe that all strictly mathematical judgments are a priori. Okay, we talked about that. And not empirical, because they carry with them necessity, which cannot be obtained from experience, right? And so that's another term. Right, empirical, you know, experiential. That's another term used for practical. A posteriori knowledge is empirical knowledge. So in this quote right here, we're focusing on mathematics, and we're using mathematics as an example, right? So I'm skipping 10 lines here. We're on page 16, actually. The concept of 12, the number 12, is by no means thought by merely thinking of the combination of 7 and 5, right? Because we're thinking about this math equation. 7 plus 5 is 12. So that's a math equation. So is that a priori knowledge? Certainly, but it's deeper than that, right? The concept of 12 is by no means thought by merely thinking of the combination of 7 and 5, and analyze this possible sum as we may, we shall not discover 12 in the concept. we must go beyond these concepts by calling to our aid some intuition which corresponds to one of the concepts, that is either our 5 fingers or 5 points. So, what he's saying is like, okay, there's more to it than just like these abstract ideas of 5 and these pure objective ideas of 5 and 7, which equals 12, right? There is some sort of synthesizing going on in our minds. Like, well, what is 5? Like, what is 5? And he's like, well, a lot of people, we learn it by counting our fingers, or we see it on dots on a number line, and now we're getting like this objective idea through a sensibility, through an empirical thought process. We're using empirical ways to reach this objective concept. So that's important. And we must add successfully that the units of the 5 given in the intuition to the concept of 7. Hence, our concept is really amplified by the proposition 7 plus 5 equals 12. And we add to the first concept and second concept not thought in it. Arithmetical judgments are therefore synthetical, and the more plainly according as we take larger numbers, for in such cases it is clear that however closely we analyze our concepts without calling intuition to our aid, we can never find the sum by such mere dissection. There's this idea of, okay, you put 7 and 5 together, like we have this concept of addition, like, well, is that truly objective? Well, I mean, yes, but also there's this operation that we've created through this synthetic process, right? That's another term used, synthetic, right, to describe practical or a posteriori right? knowledge, experiential knowledge. So, but I'll continue here. Just as little is any principle of geometry analytical, that a straight line is the shortest path between 2 points is a synthetic proposition. Because how did we know that, right? We know that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line through experience. We've come to that conclusion based off of our experiential understanding of the world. Is like, oh, okay. So based off of what we've experienced in this world, we've come to this objective understanding that the shortest path between 2 locations is a straight line. So you don't want to get fooled. See, this is what's important. You don't want to get fooled by thinking like, well, that's just, well, duh. Like that's always been that. I mean, that's a thing that exists. Right? That's a thing that's always been there, right? Before we've come to the understanding of it. But that's not necessarily true, right? We've only come to that conclusion because we've experienced that as always the case, right? And you can argue about theoretical concepts like wormholes and stuff like that kind of break that notion, or like alter the way we understand that concept. When we look at space and we look at like space as a multi-dimensional matrix, right? There's that idea of a line is the shortest distance between 2 points can be understood differently based off of like different kinds of experience, right? For my concept of straight contains nothing of quantity but only a quality. Like, what do you mean straight? What do you mean straight? It's like we thought of that conceptually through experience, right? The concept shortest is therefore altogether additional. It cannot be obtained by any analysis of the concept straight line. Here too, intuition must come to aid us. It alone makes this synthesis possible, right? So I put in my notes here. I wrote little notes in the margins. Is math discovered or created? Yeah, that's like one of the famous philosophical questions. Like, did we create math, or has math always been there? And we're just discovering it. And I would argue both. I mean, kind of A, kind of B. We can only create abstractions about true reality, right? This implies a limit to an understanding of reality. So like mathematics, I would argue is an abstraction, a way that we understand reality, universally, and it's like the closest thing we have to like understanding universal reality, right? Our reality in this like objective way. But is that like truly how reality is structured? Well, that's the way we can perceive it, but that might not necessarily be the way that reality ultimately breaks down, right? And you notice that through like all these mathematical poles, right? You know, biggest example is singularities in space, like the middle of a black hole. In mathematics, what ends up happening is that you divide by zero, which makes no sense. So, and then there's all types of other mathematical paradoxes and contradictions. This is not to insult mathematics, but it's just to say that there's a limit to our understanding of objective reality, right? And so what math is an approximation based off of our experiential interaction with space, right? And that's important to understand. And then I put in my notes as well, awareness of this is key. We then do not accidentally fall into false understandings, right? We start to assume like, oh, okay, this is always how it's been, and you know, math is like the true reality. So then you'll fall into the trap of like, we can just make mathematical equations out of anything, and they describe reality perfectly, right? You get these things like string theory and like higher dimensional space, you know, and these theoretical mathematical concepts, which are, you know, derive all these physics, right? Which might not necessarily true, but the math works out. So we have to understand, like, well, you know, we have to pump the brakes here. Maybe like, you know, mathematics is like a way we're synthesizing the world. But there's a limit to that because we don't understand everything yet, right? And so, you know, you get into all types of conundrums doing that. But let me continue. This is page 17. Okay, this is the second line. But the question is not what we must join in thought to the given concept, but what we actually think together with. And in it, though obscurely, and so it appears that the predicate belongs to this concept necessarily indeed. Yet not directly, but indirectly by means of an intuition, right? Which must be present. So there's an intuition that must be present. Like, okay, there's the number 5. Like, oh, well, there's, you know, that was conceptualized. Like numbers were conceptualized via like this sense of like, okay, there is an amount or or a unit there, and we have to like numerate this. So where there's an intuition happening, which is separate but describes objective reality. So it's not objective reality, but it's our closest description of objective reality. But then how does it describe objective reality? Like, we're going to get into that further, but okay, I'll skip a paragraph here. The essential and distinguishing feature of pure mathematical knowledge among all other a priori knowledge is that it cannot at all proceed from concepts, but only by means of the construction of concepts, right? So that's how we get a priori knowledge in Kant's view is done by constructing concepts. The pure concepts are inaccessible to us, right? But we can construct objective ideas that then become like a priori knowledge, right? You know, it's interesting, but it's important. I'll skip down the line. These propositions neither can nor ought to arise analytically, but dissection of the concept, but are all synthetical, right? So analytic versus synthetic. So these are two other words to describe a priori and a posteriori, if I'm even pronouncing that correctly. I don't know. I cannot refrain from pointing out the disadvantage resulting to philosophy from the neglect of this easy and apparently insignificant observation. Right? So, you know, Kant is making this big point. It's like, look, this is important, right? It's important. It isn't just like, well, this idea that either, well, math is discovered, right? It's always been the case. And so we arrive at these like absolute concepts. It's like, well, no, that's not necessarily true. And also, there's the idea, which Hume pushed, which we'll get into in a minute, like, well, we don't really actually ever arrive at absolute, like, true a priori objective knowledge that's beyond us, so it's irrelevant. Right? Which and Kant's like, well, that's a mistake too. So let's get to it, right? So Kant critiques Hume here, and he says, David Hume, for how it is possible, says that acute man, that when a concept is given me, I can go beyond it and connect with it another which is not contained in it, in such a manner as if the latter necessarily belonged to the former. Nothing but experience can be furnished us with such connections. Thus he concluded from the difficulty which he took to be impossibility, and all that faunted necessarily, or what is the same thing, knowledge to be a priori, is nothing but a long habit of accepting something as true, and hence of mistaking subjective necessity for objective. Okay, so I'm sorry, this is actually page 24, and this is the fifth to the last line of that page where I started. And so the great insight of Hume was that there's an error that happens with human beings, is we mistake subjective truth as objective truth, right? Hume was saying, so Kant is acknowledging, like, okay, Hume did bring that up, and he's like saying, like, human beings, like, we often will have this subjective idea of something, and then we assume that's like that is actually how it ultimately is. And that leads us to a lot of problems, right? We get into a lot of falsehoods by doing that. Because what'll happen is, like, we'll come to this realization, like, oh, actually our conception of this thing isn't actually what it truly is, and then we'll get into all types of mistakes and follies and things like that. And so it's very important to, like, acknowledge there's the difference between subjectivity and objectivity. But then you ask this question, this is page 25, third paragraph, third line, how are synthetic cognitions a priori possible? Right, I'll put in my notes. Experiential interpretations of objective truth is what is to be explained in this text. So, the idea is, like I mentioned before, like, well, we're human beings, we have a limit to our sense perception, right? We have our ability to sense and perceive, and that's not infinite, right? And reality is, there's a lot about reality that we can never get to, because, we only have a limited amount of senses, right? And a limited ability to perceive, right? So is it possible to get to knowledge that is truly objective? Or are we just limited always to subjective knowledge? Like, it only applies to us subjectively, but never objectively. But Kant argues, like, well, no, actually you can get to objective knowledge, right? You could do that through experience, because all we have is experience, all we have is sense perception, but there's an awareness of limitation, right? And, we have to understand what does that mean? Like, a priori knowledge, like, what is that? Is it necessarily the thing in and of itself, like the subatomic reality of this book? Well, that's part of it, but that's not all a priori knowledge, right? So that's what we're going to get into. Okay, this is page 30, and this is the third paragraph. For that objects of sense can only be intuited according to this form of sensibility, I can know a priori. Hence it follows that propositions which concern this form of sensuous intuition only are possible and valid for objects of the senses, as also conversely that intuitions which are possible a priori can never concern any other things than objects of our senses. Let me pause here and I'll read you my notes right here. our comprehension of objective reality is limited to our sense perception. The object is not understood as it actually is, but only how it can be perceived. So, yeah. So the book, for instance, I'm describing you this book. I could talk about the ideas in the book, or I could talk about, this is paper with like black ink on it. And then I can go further, like, well, actually it's atoms and, but it's going to be a limit to like how I can describe this book, because I can only describe to you how it can be perceived, and perception can be beyond like just sense perception, like our senses. Our senses. It can also just be like what we can comprehend. An example of this is our idea of a wave in physics, right? A wave, like what is a wave? You go in the ocean, you see waves, or you think of like a radio wave, and we have a mathematical description of a wave. But what is actually a wave? What is it? we don't fully understand what it is. We have various perceptions of what a wave is, but we don't ultimately know what it is, right? But that's okay, because we are limited to these understandings of what waves are, and they are very useful to us, and we'll go into why they are useful to us and why they are. Certain perceptions of wave are a priori, and they're not just a posteriori. They're not just experiential, they are objective. But we'll get into that, why that is. But let me continue reading here from where I left off. Accordingly, it is only the form of sensuous intuition by which we can intuit things a priori, but by which we can know objects only as they appear to us, to our senses, not as they are in themselves. And this assumption is absolutely necessary if synthetic propositions a priori be granted as possible, or if, in the case they actually occur, their possibility is to be comprehended and determined beforehand. And you just got to think of like, maybe like a Venn diagram or something like that. I don't know if I can show you the thing I wrote here. Let me see. Okay, that's pretty, that's good enough. Maybe I should have got like a chalkboard or something. So, there's objective reality, right? There's like objective reality, and then there's sense perception in the middle there. That's us, what we can perceive. And then I put our scope of cognition is that sense perception, right? Now, part of that is objective reality, but it's not all of it, right? So that's the mistake that we need to avoid. We got to avoid like, our sense perception can come to some idea of objective reality, but it's not all of objective reality. And likewise, what you don't want to also make the mistake is, you don't want to make the mistake is objective reality is one circle and then sense perception is like somewhere else. It's outside objective reality, which is also not true. This is also not true. There are, I was gonna say like there are perception ideas that are not aligned with objective reality, but are those based off of sense perception, or are those just completely imagination, or lies or fabrications or false, and these are the things we have to understand. But let me read page 31. I'm starting at the end of the fourth line. Pure intuitions that lie a priori are the basis of the empirical. Hence, they can never be omitted, but at the same time, by their being pure intuitions a priori, they prove that they are mere forms of our sensibility, which must precede all empirical intuition, that is, perception of actual objects, and conformably to which objects can be known a priori, but only as they appear to us. So this is what we're talking about. Let me skip down a line. Synthetic cognition a priori is possible only by referring to no other objects than those of the senses. Right? We looked at that diagram. At the basis of their empirical intuition lies a pure intuition, which is a priori because the latter intuition is nothing but the mere form of sensibility which precedes the actual appearance of the objects since in fact it makes them possible. And it makes them possible to us. But actually, not only does it make it possible to us, it makes them possible, right? Just think about this. Like, think about like a circle, or like, you know, a fundamental shape, like a sphere, right? You know, you look at the planets, planet Earth, this is a sphere, or is shaped roughly like a sphere. You know, and then you say like, well, because gravity, you know, that's the way gravity attracts, and it, you know, forms objects into these spherical things, and we create, you know, mathematics, geometry off this basis. So there is this objective understanding of that. But, you know, what is a sphere? Like, well, to us, like, we perceive the effect of gravity taking hold of mass as a sphere. That's how we perceive it. Maybe there's this higher understanding or this higher perception where it's not a sphere. Maybe it's some other type of object that we are unaware of. You know, that's the thing, right? We're only limited, like we assume, like, we see these objects, right? And we assume like, oh, you know, that's just how ultimately it is. It is like, well, that's just how we see it, right? Based off of how we sense and perceive things. But there are other types of perception where maybe it's not like the planet is in some other form that we're unaware of, you know, because of, you know, there's limits to how we perceive things, you know. So I put in my notes here, the perception of the object is the object because we are limited to only its perception. Right? The true object outside our perception is inaccessible to us. Currently, like, we don't understand, if we're just using physics as an example, we continue the physics example, there's these things that we describe as dark matter. And what is dark matter? We see its effects. We sense its perceptions. Like, we have perceptions of these things through observation, but we don't know ultimately what dark matter is. Like, that's just a name that we give it to it. And maybe, like, if we had a higher perception ability to perceive, we would be able to perceive this dark matter as an object, and that would influence the other objects like regular matter. And then maybe these other forms of matter wouldn't be, like, planets would not appear as spheres, they would appear as something else with the inclusion of dark matter as its object. You know, you see what I'm saying? But that's outside of us. For now, maybe one day we will use some instruments to be able to perceive some objectivity of dark matter beyond its influence. But there will always be a limit, because we won't be able to ultimately understand or perceive it in its truest sense, because we can only go so far, because there's a limit to our physical perception, right? And that's all that's being said. The mistake that you want to avoid is this idea, like, well, you know, what we know is, what we perceive is that's ultimate reality, which is not true. And then the other folly you want to, like, make sure you don't subject yourself to is this understanding, well, you know, I mean, we're never going to, like, you know, because we can't ultimately understand dark matter to its truest sense, it doesn't matter. Right? It's irrelevant to us. It's like, well, that's not true either. Right? So it's acknowledging both. Right? But let me continue here. Yet this faculty of intuiting a priori affects not the matter of the phenomena, that is, the sensation in it, for this constitutes that which is empirical, but its form. Right? And so they're saying, like, you know, our understanding of the a priori is not, like, changing the thing in and of itself. Like, there's no way of us accessing that. We just have this limited understanding of it, which is objective, but we still aren't able to access it, the true thing in and of itself, right? What dark matter really is, for instance, that's just an example that we're using. We may never access it, and even if we start getting better understanding of the thing, we still probably will be limited to like, well, we won't truly be able to understand exactly what's going on here. Right? And then I skip down 9 lines. Objects count merely as phenomena, for then the form of the phenomena, that is pure intuition, can by all means be represented as proceeding from ourselves, that is a priori. So, you know, there's this, let's keep it with the dark matter example with physics, right? Or astrophysics, right? There's the idea or this notion like, well, dark matter is a theory. it's a dark matter is like this theoretical concept, and it's not, right? Dark matter is not a theory. It's like it's a set of observations, right, that we see, we perceive them, right? They're phenomena that we can observe. They're not theory. The theory is like what is dark matter, like what ultimately. Then you can get into the theories of that. But dark matter is a phenomena that occurs, and that is an object. Like the phenomena, the influence of dark matter is an object. It is a priori knowledge, right? As limited as it is to us, to like how we perceive it, it is a priori because it affects us in like profound ways. Like it's how galaxies form. It's literally the reason why we exist, right? Because of its influence on space and time and such, right? And you know, so that's all that's being said there. And I put in my notes here, the object becomes our relation with it, right? The object is more than this relation, but that is unknown to us. So how do we know dark matter? We know it through its phenomena, which is its relation with us, through its influence, right? That's how we understand and can comprehend and know dark matter. And that's a priori knowledge, right? Is what Kant is saying. But it's true, like we don't know absolutely what dark matter is, but there is an understanding that it's there, something is happening. and so that's important to understand, you know, and I bring this up. What's important is like, I don't want people to be like, yeah, see, you're just talking about random shit. This is philosophy in a nutshell. Like these are irrelevant things. But the problem is, like, this is very important because people will make mistakes like, oh, dark matter is just this thing that doesn't exist. It's just a theory. It's just this idea, this conception. It's made up. Like, you know, it's just something that's made up. It's like, well, that's not true. Because, you know, and we do that with a number of things, whether it's physics or like economics or like, you know, social relations, right? Just going back to the Black Ponderer, that's how racism is treated nowadays. It's like, oh, racism doesn't exist. It's just all in our heads. You know, if we just like don't acknowledge it, it'll just go away, right? And it's like, well, it's like a conception, but it has these real impacts, these real influences, which are objective, right? So racism is an actual thing that's real and it's happening in multiple ways, you know. And that's just another example. You know, another example would be like the stock market, right? In economics, which is made up concepts, but have these real influences and effects on people's livelihoods. And, you know, we can go on and on. And it's just a way to understand how reality works. And it's an important thing to acknowledge. So, I'll just keep going with this concept. This is page 34, second paragraph. Pure mathematics, and especially pure geometry, can have objective reality only on condition that they refer merely to objects of sense. Right? So it's just reiterating what we've said. Mathematics only applies because it matters to us in terms of our senses, our perception. Right? If it's outside of that, then, you know, it's beyond us. Right. So there's this there's this subjective objectivity going on, right? But in regard to the latter, the principle holds good that our sense representation is not a representation of things in themselves, but of the way in which they appear to us. Hence, it follows that the propositions of geometry are not the result of a mere creation of our poetic imaginations. Right? They aren't just like it's not just fantasy, right? So that's another thing. You know, and that therefore they cannot be referred with assurance to actual objects, but rather they are necessarily valid of space and consequently of all that may be found in space, because space is nothing else than the form of all external appearances. And it is this form alone in which objects of sense can be given to us. And that's important to understand. Like, you might say like, well, you know, space, whether we perceive it or not, it's still there, right? But the thing is, like, it's there, but it's, you know, it's something other than how we perceive it. So, of course, like, objects still exist without our perception, but the way, like, we perceive them in this unique way, right? And so, like, our understanding of these things are, you know, of our creation that is objective, right? Another being would perceive them differently, and they would be something else, which is not to say that our perception of the thing is made up or fantasy. Is not, but but that's what Kant is talking about here. He's talking about like, well, our understanding of space is our own understanding of space, right? And it's valid to us because it influences us objectively, right? But it might not be the case for other beings or other kinds of sense perception, right? That's all you say. A sensibility, the form of which is the basis of geometry, is that upon which the possibility of external appearance depends. Therefore, these appearances can never contain anything but what geometry prescribes to them. Then I put in my notes, our conceptions of reality, math, space, and time, are real, but they are only real to us. This exclusivity doesn't negate their realness, but it does imply other realities beyond us. Okay? And that's what Kant wants you to understand. This is page 35, the fourth to the last line of the first paragraph. Sensibility, by means of its form of external intuition, namely by space, with which the geometer is occupied, makes those objects possible as mere appearances. Right? Again, like, we only know a triangle because we perceive the triangle, we perceive the three sides, right? Which is not to say that triangle doesn't exist. It does. It has real effects. But, you know, I think it's important to repeat this. And one of the cool things about Kant is, like, in his works, he repeats himself a lot. You might read his work, it's like, damn, this is a big ass text. But a lot of it is him just repeating it over and over and over again in, like, slightly different ways. So, you know, one of the things about Kant, I would encourage you, if you decide to read him, and you're like, damn, this is big, or like you read it, it's like, I don't understand what the hell you said, but don't worry about that because he's going to repeat himself many times. So repetition, you know, that might be some encouragement for you if you read what he's saying. It's like, I don't understand any of this. Don't worry, because the next 20 pages he'll just say the same thing in a different way, right? He does that a lot. This is page 36. This is the fifth line of the third paragraph. Things as objects of our senses existing outside us are given, but we know nothing of what they may be in themselves, knowing only their appearances, that is, the representations which they cause in us by affecting our senses. There are bodies without us, that is, things which, though quite unknown to us as to what they are in themselves, we yet know by the representations which their influence in our sensibility procures us. The appearance of the thing, which is unknown to us, but not therefore less actual. Yeah, so he's just saying, like, yeah, there are objects that are beyond our perception, which are real, but we can never know them, and that's fine. But we have to acknowledge that they are there. Like, it's all, you know, that implies, like, our knowledge of things is not all knowledge that exists. So we might run into some accidents. We might assume, like, oh, I know this thing. And it's like, well, you only know part of the thing, right? So be aware of that. And this is the second to last line of that page. The actual existence of external things, that many of their predicates may be said to belong, not to the things in themselves, but to their appearances, and to have no proper existence outside our representation. Heat, color, and taste, for instance, are of this kind, right? heat, color, taste. Right? These are things that exist because of our sense perception. Without us, these concepts, heat is just infrared light. Heat is light, right? So, how we perceive these things is not like their ultimate reality, right? But that's not to say there's no such thing as heat, right? Heat is definitely a thing that's real, and it can, if something's too hot, it's going to cause you pain, it's going to hurt you, right? Or if something's too cold, you can die from hypothermia, right? So, real things, but our sense perception limits us to how we can interact with them. So this is the 10th line of page 37. Colors not to be properties of the object itself, but only as modifications of the sense of sight. And I put in my notes, existence is a Venn diagram. Well, I showed you that. Realities, with each reality having degrees of legitimacy. Right? I showed you that diagram. And this is the last paragraph of page 37. Hence, we may at once dismiss an easily foreseen but futile objection that by admitting the ideality of space and of time, the whole sensible world would be turned into a mere sham. Right? So you say no, the way we perceive the world is not a sham. It's a thing that actually exists. It's actually a priori knowledge. Right? It's a priori knowledge. But, there are other ways of perception which are beyond us. And this is page 38, 5th line. The difference between truth and dreaming is not ascertained by the nature of the representations which are referred to objects, for they are the same in both cases, but by their connection according to those rules which determine the coherence of the representations in the concept of an object, and by ascertaining whether they can subsist together in experience or not. So now we're getting to the heart of what is a priori knowledge? And he's saying it's basically by the coherence of representations of the concept of the object. So it's about universality, how many people are able to interpret this thing universally. That's how a priori knowledge. I put in my notes, truth is determined by the universality and harmonizality. Yeah, that's a word. The harmony, the harmonality, the general application, I should say, of a thing. Its ability to coexist, right? Is what it is. A triangle exists because we all perceive the triangle the same way, more or less, right? 3 points, 3 sides. The triangle. When I say a circle, we all have a shared understanding of that. And so that's where we become, this is what objective reality is. This is universality. It still might not necessarily describe the ultimate reality of what's going on. But it's the way most of us perceive, or maybe even all of us perceive it as such, right? And so that's a priori knowledge, this universality, this general application of concepts. But let me continue what I was reading. And it is not the fault of the appearances of our cognition takes illusion for truth. That is, if the intuition by which an object is given us is considered a concept of the thing, or even if its existence, which the understanding can only think. So just because our sense perception is limited doesn't mean that the thing isn't true. Right? The triangle, or let's use another object, a square, or a cube. A cube might not actually be what's going on geometrically, or our conception of geometry might not be exactly how the world is, or the existence really is. But that's just the way that we are limited to perceiving reality. And that's not an illusion, right? That's truth, right? It's true to us. So how is we talked about Hume, but in some ways you can interpret Hume by saying we only know things because we are continuously experiencing the same things over and over again. The triangle is a triangle because we keep seeing the three sides, over and over and over again. They keep getting reiterated to us, and that's how we're able to perceive. So it's basically off of sense perception, and nothing really is a priori knowledge. It's only this consistent conceptual knowledge where we build all of our understanding. And Kant disagrees. He's like, well, no, that's that's what's happening, but there is some objectivity that's not just based off of consistency. It's just this. It's more like universality. That's where a priori knowledge. That's where we can access a priori knowledge, right? So this is page 45, and this is the second paragraph. We shall here be concerned with experience only in the universal conditions of the possibility, which are given a priori. Thence we shall define nature as the whole object of all possible experience. I skip down 5 lines. I mean to ask how the conditions a priori of the possibility of experience are at the same time the sources from which all universal laws of nature must be derived. So we're getting at this question. While all judgments of experience and empirical, that is, have their ground in immediate sense perception, all empirical judgments are not judgments of experience. So that's where he differs from Hume. He's like, well, it's not all just experience. So some of it is judgments of objectivity, right? But how so? And he says, but besides the empirical and in general, besides what is given to the sensuous intuition, special concepts must yet be superadded, concepts which have their origin wholly a priori, in the pure understanding, and under which every perception must be first of all subsumed and then by their means changed into experience. So we use that example of 5 plus 7 equals 12. So there was some sort of cognitive leap that happened. Like there was something that happened. It was based off of sense, but then we did something more. We augmented that. We're like, okay, we have this thing that we perceive as 5. We have this thing we perceive as 7. Then we let's create this addition thing. There you go. Like that's not sense. It's like a creation of some objectivity, right? And then there's some judgment that's going on that is beyond sense, beyond sense perception. There's this abstraction that happens, right? That's objective. And then I'll just keep going. Empirical judgments, so far as they have objective validity, are judgments of experience, but those which are only subjectively valid, I name mere judgments of perception. So judgments of perception. There's this perception that goes on in our heads that is beyond the experience. So everything is based off of experience, but then we build up and we create these perceptions that kind of are built upon experience, but then are more. They become a kind of objectivity, right? Now the thing is, the objectivity is based off of our sense perception, but then they become this a priori knowledge, and they become this a priori knowledge because of their universal applicability. I don't know if I'm just making up words or not. I put in my notes, as opposed to empirical judgments that are universally valid, are judgments of objectivity. Okay, this is page 46, second paragraph. Our judgments are at first merely judgments of perception. They hold good only for us, that is, for our subject, and we do not till afterward give them a new reference to an object and desire that they shall always hold good for us and in the same way for everybody else. For when a judgment agrees with an object, all judgments concerning the same object must likewise agree among themselves. And thus the objective validity of the judgment of experience signifies nothing else than its necessary universal validity. And that's what we were talking about. And then this is the third paragraph. Therefore, objective validity and necessary universality for everybody are equivalent terms, and though we do not know the object in itself, Yet when we consider a judgment as universal and hence necessary, we thereby understand it to have objective validity. So, objectivity, a priori, that's the same thing as universality. Same thing. This general application for everybody. By this judgment, we know the object, though it remains unknown as it is in itself, by the universal and necessary connections of the given perceptions. Judgments of experience take their objective validity not from the immediate knowledge of the object, which is impossible, but from the condition of universal validity of empirical judgments, which, as already said, never rests upon empirical or, in short, sensuous conditions, but upon a pure concept of the understanding. So there's this pure objective understanding of the sense. Like we make meaning out of our sense perception that becomes objective. So what is that? That is its universal application. Right, that's what that is. And I'll put in my notes here, the theory of how the object relates to us, our understanding of the interrelation of the object, its place in the ecology of reality. So, that's a kind of a thing here at the Black Ponderer. I talk about reality as its ecology. Right? Everything is interrelating with everything else, and there's this shared perception of things, and this interaction, this influence. And so a priori knowledge is a shared understanding of this influence between things that we all have. And the meanings of those things as they relate to us, how they influence us. Right? And this is page 49. This is the second paragraph. If all our synthetic judgments are analyzed so far as they are objectively valid, it will be found that they never consist of mere intuitions connected only, as is commonly believed, by comparison into a judgment, but that they would be impossible were not a pure concept of the understanding superadded to the concepts abstracted from intuition, and under which concept these latter are subsumed, and in this manner only combine into an objectively valid judgment. And so I put in my notes, judgments that arrive to objective validity, universal applicability, are discovered to contain more than intuition. It is their universality, however you pronounce it, that reveals its a priori nature. Okay? Right. So we're saying, what is a priori knowledge? It is knowledge that can be applied universally. That's a priori knowledge. And that's not all of a priori knowledge, but that's a section of a priori knowledge that is accessible to us. And then this is page 57, second paragraph. Above all, the reader must pay attention to the mode of proof of the principles which occur under the title of analogies of experience. For these do not refer to the genesis of intuitions, as do the principles of applying mathematics to natural science in general, but to the connection of their existence in experience. Okay? And this can be nothing but determination of their existence in time according to necessary laws, under which alone to the connection is objectively valid and thus becomes experience. The proof, therefore, does not turn on the synthetic unity in the connection of things in themselves, but merely of perceptions, and of these not in regard to their matter, but to the determination of time and of the relation of their existence in according to universal laws. So here we go, Kant's just repeating himself, which is very useful because he's talking about very complicated things. And that's very good. I like Kant, he does that, he repeats himself. If the empirical determination in relative time is indeed to be objectively valid, that is, to be experienced, these universal laws must contain a necessary determination of existence in time generally, namely, according to a rule of the understanding a priori. Note-taking time. I wrote here. A priori for us is not things in of themselves. I mean, that is a priori knowledge, is the true thing in and of itself, but that's inaccessible to us. So can we access a priori knowledge? Yes, How so? Through its universal relation with things. That's how we access a priori knowledge, is through its universal relation with everything. This is general application, like, geometric shapes, for instance. Okay, I skipped down the line. My reader, who has probably been long accustomed to consider experience a mere empirical synthesis of perceptions, and hence has not considered that it goes much beyond them, since it imparts to empirical judgments universal validity. So this universal validity is a kind of a priori knowledge that we create. Furthermore, like, we don't just create it. It was always there because this is how we are able to interact with the thing that we're talking about. And for that purpose requires a pure and a priori unity of the understanding. Is recommended to pay special attention to this distinction of experience from a mere aggregate of perceptions and to judge the mode of proof from this point of view. So, like the scientific method, for instance, like, observe, and then, do experimentation and do peer review. And if everybody comes to an objective agreement to, like, okay, we agree, like, this is what's actually going on, then it becomes like a kind of a priori knowledge based off of our observation, but it becomes like this universal validity, right, that we can then build upon, right? And that's a priori, is what Kant is saying. Okay, this is page 458 at the top. I add that we comprehend just as little the concept of subsistence, that is, the necessity that at the foundation of the existence of things there lies a subject which cannot itself be a predicate of any other thing. Nay, we cannot even form a notion of the possibility of such a thing, though we can point out examples of its use in experience. The very same incomprehensibility affects the community of things, as we cannot comprehend how, from the state of one thing in inference to the state of quite another thing beyond it, and vice versa, can be drawn, and how substances, which have each their own separate existence, should depend upon one another necessarily. But I am very far from holding these concepts to be derived merely from experience, and the necessity represented in them to be imaginary and a mere illusion produced in us by long habit. On the contrary, so Kant is saying that's what Hume concludes. It's just everything is an illusion based off of this long habit of, like, okay, I see the thing, I see the thing, I see the thing, I see the thing. Oh, it exists, right? I mean, we did a few videos about Hume. Hume's famous example, he used a number of famous examples, but one was the rising sun. It's like, well, we're always seeing the sun rising, so I guess the sun always rises. But, Hume would argue, like, one day the sun might not rise. We don't know that for sure. We just assume that's the case. And he says, like, that's all knowledge is based off that, like this habitual, like, observation, and then we just assume everything's based off of an assumption, and nothing is really real. But Kant argues, like, well, that's not how our knowledge is formed. Actually, he says, on the contrary, I have amply shown that they and the principles derived from them are firmly established a priori, right, before all experience, and have their undoubted objective value, though only with regard to experience. And that's not to say, like, Hume is necessarily wrong. He might be right. But this is Kant's point of view. I don't know, I kind of lean toward what Kant's saying. I put in my notes here, there is a spectra of a priori. Yep. So everything is a spectrum, right? Even a priori knowledge, like a priori knowledge that is interacted with via experience, and a priori knowledge which is beyond experience. There's two kinds of a priori knowledge, or it's a spectrum, and there's on one side or within a certain section of the spectrum is what we can access through our sense perception, but then there's all this other a priori knowledge that is just beyond us. Just like light. It's just think of it like that. There's visible light, and then there's all these other forms of light that we can't perceive, right? Okay, this is page 59 at the top. The question is not how things in themselves, but how the empirical knowledge of things is determined. As regards the above aspects of judgments in general, That is, how things as objects of experience can and must be subsumed under these concepts of the understanding. And I put in my notes. So that this is the main question Kant attempts to answer. Like, the question is like not how we know things in and of themselves. That's like not the question we should be asking. It's like, how does our experience interact with the thing in and of itself? We might not necessarily know the thing in and of itself, but the thing in and of itself has an influence on us. Right? And that's what we need to, that's what a priori knowledge to us, or that's how it's relevant to us. This is page 60, second paragraph, second line. The pure concepts of the understanding their a priori origin, and for the universal laws of nature, their validity as laws of understanding, yet in such a way as to limit their use to experience, because their possibility depends solely on the reference of the understanding to experience, but with a completely reverse mode of connection. They do not derive from experience, but experience derives from them. This is therefore the result of all our foregoing inquiries. All synthetic principles, a priori, are nothing more than principles of possible experience, and can never be referred to things in themselves, but to appearances as objects of experience. And this is the last paragraph of page 60 at the top. And thus we have at last something definite upon which to depend in all metaphysical enterprises. So he's saying, like, Kant is saying, like, hey, this is what metaphysics is. We need to analyze or think deeply about how our sense perception interacts with things in and of themselves. Metaphysics that focuses on objects in their truest sense, that's inaccessible metaphysics, because we could never know that. But what we can know is how they interact with us, right? And that is a kind of metaphysics. In fact, that is the only metaphysics that is applicable to us. Okay, this is page 66, second paragraph, second line. Universal laws of nature can be known a priori leads naturally to the proposition that the highest legislation of nature must lie in ourselves, that is, in our understanding, and that we must not seek the universal laws of nature in nature by means of experience, but conversely, must seek nature as to its universal conformity to law in the conditions of the possibility of experience, which lie in our sensibility and in our understanding. For how were it otherwise possible to know a priori these laws, as they are not rules of analytical knowledge, but truly synthetical extensions of it? And so he's just saying, like, yeah, like, this is how we know a priori knowledge, is through like a synthetic application. Like, it starts off with our sense perception, and then we start adding on to that through objective perception. Perception that's not limited to subjectivity, perception that goes beyond into objectivity. And how does that happen? Through its universal application, how it affects everybody in the same way. And that's an a priori kind of investigation. So let's conclude here. This is page 100, top of the page. By and by, when it was perceived that the very same principles that are used in experience insensibly and apparently with the same right led still further than experience extends, then men began to doubt even the principles of experience. But there is no danger, for common sense will doubtless always assert its rights. A certain confusion, however, arose in science, which cannot determine how far reason to be trusted and why, only so far and no farther. And this confusion can only be cleared up and all future relapses obviated by a formal determination on principle of the boundary of the use of our reason. Okay, yeah, so that you talk about that confusion of like, well, we can never really know the things that how they actually are. So what can we do? Oh no. Or it's like, well, things as they actually are don't matter. So we shouldn't be wasting our time worrying about it. It's like, God is like, these are confusions. Like, we can actually do both of these things, but in a sensible way. Right? And then he continues, we cannot indeed be beyond all possible experience, form a definite concept of what things in themselves may be, Yet we are not at liberty to abstain entirely from inquiring into them. For experience never satisfies reason fully, but in answering questions refers us further and further back and leaves us dissatisfied with regard to their complete solution. And I put in my notes, true metaphysics is acknowledging the limit of our comprehension of existence and then working within those confines, right? And not like just giving up, being like, oh damn, we have this limitation, all is lost, we can't even try. It's like, well, no, you just work within the confines of your limitation, which is a lot. I skipped down the line. Having acquired as regards the nature of our soul a clear conception of the subject and having come to the conviction that its manifestations cannot be explained materialistically, who can refrain from asking what the soul really is, and, if no conception of experience suffices for the purpose, from accounting for it by a concept of reason, that of a simple immaterial being, though we cannot by any means prove its objective reality. Who can satisfy himself with mere empirical knowledge in all the cosmological questions of the duration and of the magnitude of the world, of freedom, or of natural necessity, since every answer given on principles of experience begets a fresh question, which likewise requires its answer and thereby clearly shows the insufficiency of all physical modes of explanation to satisfy reason? So the question is, can philosophy be satisfied with this limit? And Kant's answer is like, yeah, of course. But, there's that conundrum of, oh no, how can we go beyond this limit? And Kant's like, you don't have to. And you don't have to be lost in this despair of not ever reaching that limit as well. This is page 101, third paragraph, second line. In mathematics and in natural philosophy, human reason admits of limits, but not of bounds. Namely, it admits that something indeed lies without it, and at which it can never arrive, but not that it will at any point find completion in its internal progress. The enlarging of our views in mathematics and the possibility of new discoveries are infinite. And the same is the case with the discovery of new properties of nature, of new powers, and laws by continued experience in its rational combination. So there's a limit, but within that, when I showed you the little diagram with the circle with that little circle, we will always be finding new things within that. Even he's saying math and science itself are built to allow for limitations and okay, there's certain things you can't know, but what we can know, there's a huge field of discovery there. But let me continue here. But limits cannot be mistaken here, for mathematics refers to appearances only. And what cannot be an object of sensuous intuition, such as the concepts of metaphysics and of morals, lies entirely without its sphere. It can never lead to them, but neither does it require them. There is therefore not a continual progress in approximation towards these sciences, and there is not, as it were, any point or line of contact. Let me read you my notes here. We must make philosophical progress within our scope of sense perception only, which is infinite. Right? And I say only. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but Kant argues you can only do that because we are only limited to our sense perception. But don't trip about that, because there's infinite realm in that field, that scope. And when you start trying to waste time outside that scope, you're not going to get anywhere. But I'll keep reading the text. Natural science will never reveal to us the internal constitution of things, which, though not appearance, yet can serve as the ultimate ground for explaining appearances. Nor does that science require this for its physical explanations. Nay, even such grounds should be offered from other sources, for instance, the influence of immaterial beings. They must be rejected and not used in the progress of its explanations. For these explanations must only be grounded upon that which as an object of sense can belong to experience, and be brought into connection with our actual perceptions and empirical laws. And he's saying, like, you know, I mean, the point he's making here is paranormal and supernatural rationalizations should also be rejected if they don't apply to, if they're not grounded on experience or sense perception. You know, like that should be thrown out the window too. Everything is grounded off perceptions and empirical laws. That's what Kant is saying. But through perceptions and empiricism and senses, right, we can get to objectivity, and we do that through figuring out how our senses lead us to universality, right? Through like a shared understanding of reality, how reality applies to everyone in this harmonious way, right? And then you arrive at a priori knowledge, right? So you just gotta like distinguish between subjective reality, subjective knowledge, and universal knowledge, general knowledge. And that's how you deal with this difference of a priori knowledge versus a posteriori knowledge. If I even said that right. But anyway, I thought that was a great examination of metaphysics and even epistemology. Yeah, and you know, I would encourage you to check it out. I mean, this is a great work to check out from Kant. And if you've like tried to read Critique of Pure Reason, and you're like, oh damn, I don't know what the hell's going on. You've been reading a lot, and you're still struggling. Well, why don't you try this? Why don't you try this one? Even Kant himself recommends this first to ease you into his critique of pure reason. This is actually a great introduction, because then he goes further into like, okay, if you really want to know the nature of the thing in and of itself, and like what really is that, like then he goes into depth about that if that's something you're concerned with, right? But if that's not an issue, you're not so worried about that, you check out the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics by Immanuel Kant. Well, you've been watching and listening to the Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.